The wind moved across the dry land like an old whisper carrying stories no one wanted to repeat. In that quiet stretch between the distant hills and the rough plains, a white woman hung from a wooden frame, her wrists tied above her head, a worn sign nailed just above her. The sign was cracked, sunburned, and marked with one blunt message that could chill the heart of any traveler who dared ride close enough to read it. Apache Land. It was a warning, a threat, and a challenge all at once. The dust swirled around her boots as she tried to keep her balance, her breath sharp and uneven, her throat aching from fear and thirst. She didn't know how long she had been left there or who had brought her to this place. She only knew that every hour that passed felt like the land itself was waiting for her to break. The old American frontier had a way of testing people. It didn't matter if someone came from a small town, a wealthy ranch house, or a farming family struggling to survive. The wild plains pushed everyone the same way. Out here, danger had a voice. It carried through the heat, through the dry grass, through the long shadows that moved with the sun. And every rumor that traveled through saloons and trading posts spoke of the Apache territory like it was a line no one should cross. Folks talked about the Apache with a mix of fear and respect, whispering stories of warriors who protected their land with fierce loyalty and strong pride. Some stories were twisted by fear, others shaped by truth, but none of them prepared her for the moment she found herself left alone under that harsh sun. She tried to steady herself, tried to breathe slowly, tried to remember how she had ended up on the edge of Apache territory. She remembered traveling west with a small group, moving toward a new life and new land. She remembered how they set up camp near a rocky slope, how the night sky had looked wide and peaceful. But just before dawn, everything changed. Shouting erupted. Hoofs thundered. She recalled running toward the wagons, thinking maybe the group was under attack, only to realize someone had singled her out. Her memory blurred after that. She didn't know whether the ones who took her were trying to scare her, use her, punish her, or simply send a message to others traveling through the region. All she knew was that she had been dragged across the land until she saw the wooden frame, waiting like a trap already set as she hung there. The hours passing painfully slow, she kept hoping someone might come. A traveler, a rancher, even an old prospector wandering the plains. But the land stayed empty. Buzzards circled far above, as if they had been watching her since sunrise. She tried not to look at them. The last thing she wanted was to believe they were waiting for her to give up. She forced herself to stay awake, to stay alert, to fight the hopeless feeling creeping into her mind. Still, the silence made everything worse. The sign above her kept swaying gently with the wind. Its two simple words reminding her that even if someone did find her, they might turn around out of fear. What she didn't know was that someone had been watching. Not from behind the rocks or from the trail she came from, but from the deeper shadows of the land itself. A lone Apache warrior, tall and strong, stood on a ridge nearby, studying the scene below with calm eyes. He had passed through this area many times, patrolling the land the way generations before him had done. He was known among his people for moving quietly, listening to the land and knowing when something was wrong. And what he saw now was wrong in every possible way. It wasn't Apache custom to leave a woman tied like that. It wasn't Apache style to mark someone with a sign that spoke of danger. This was something else, something that felt like a trap or message meant to stir conflict. The warrior remained still, letting the wind move around him as he observed the woman struggling to stay upright. He could tell she was frightened, thirsty, and close to losing her strength. He could also tell that whoever put her there wanted the blame to fall on his people. It was a cruel tactic used by outside groups who hoped to paint the Apache as ruthless or violent. He scanned the area again, checking for tracks, signs of riders, or hidden watchers waiting for someone to investigate. His instincts warned him to be cautious. The frontier was full of tricks and lies, and he knew better than to walk into trouble without understanding the reason behind it. Below the ridge, the woman lifted her head slightly. She thought she had heard something, maybe the scrape of stone or the shift of grass. Her heart jumped with hope and fear at the same time. She tried to call out, but her voice cracked painfully. She swallowed dry air, then tried again. This time the sound carried faintly, but not far. Her legs trembled as she tried to push back against the wooden post, but her hands were tied too tightly. The rope cut into her wrists. She had never felt so helpless. Yet she refused to believe this was where her life would end. The warrior stepped down from the ridge quietly, not making a sound heavy enough to startle the land. He knew she didn't see him yet. Most people never noticed him until he chose to be seen. He moved with the steady confidence of someone who understood every scent, every sound, every shift in the ground around him. The closer he got, the more details he saw. Her dress was torn, her arms scratched, her shoes covered in dry dust. She looked like she had been dragged or carried against her will. Her face wasn't fearful in the way he expected. It was the kind of fear that came from confusion and betrayal, not from hatred. That alone told him she didn't belong to the ones who tried to make trouble on Apache Land. He paused a short distance away, knowing the moment he stepped into her sight everything would change. He didn't know how she would react. Some white travelers learned to respect the Apache. Others only believed the stories told in fear. He didn't want to frighten her more than she already was. Still, he couldn't leave her there. Not on his land, not under that sign, not with the sun slowly burning her strength away. He moved another step, letting the dry grass shift under his boots. This time she heard it clearly. Her eyes widened as she turned her head, uncertain whether the sound meant danger or help. He raised one hand slowly, showing he had no weapon drawn and no intention of harming her. She stared at him, breath shaking, not knowing what to think. He could see the question in her eyes even from where he stood. Was he the one who did this to her, or the one who came to save her? She whispered something he barely heard, a small plea carried by the wind. He took another step forward, and then the land shifted behind him. One small sound, sharp and quick, came from the brush near the hill. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. It was the distinct snap of a branch under a boot, someone trying to stay hidden but failing. The warrior froze. His eyes narrowed. The woman felt her heart race again. Whoever had left her there wasn't far after all. The warrior didn't look back at her yet. His focus locked on the hidden danger, knowing he was no longer alone. The land around them grew silent again, tighter now, heavier, almost waiting for something to break. And in that tense moment, as he stood between the woman hanging helplessly and the unseen threat closing in, everything about the day changed. Whether he would reach her in time, whether the ones watching would strike, or whether the land itself would swallow them in a confrontation neither of them asked for remained unanswered. The only thing certain was that both their lives had just turned toward a path neither expected. And the next move could decide everything. The sound behind the warrior changed the air around them. It was small, but sharp enough to carry a warning. The woman felt the tension ripple through him even though he stood several paces away. She watched the way his shoulders stiffened, his eyes narrowing just slightly as he scanned the brush. Even tied the way she was, she sensed something shifting in the land. The plains had a way of letting danger announce itself without words. She could almost feel the earth waiting. The warrior didn't move immediately. He listened first, the way someone who had lived his entire life on open ground learned to do. A single sound could tell a story, and that branch snap was not the noise of a wild animal wandering too close. Whoever it was had weight. Whoever it was knew how to hide. That meant trouble. He lowered his hand a little, but kept it open in a gesture that told her to stay calm. She didn't know how to stay calm. Her breath came faster, her wrists stung from the tight ropes, and her knees felt weak under her. Still, she held on to the only thing she could control, which was her hope that he wasn't going to leave her the way others had. She didn't know who he was or why he had come, but he was the only living soul who had not looked at her with malice or fear. He turned his head slightly, speaking to her in a low voice that carried steady reassurance. He told her he would not harm her. His tone was calm, grounded, like a man who meant every word he spoke. She didn't understand everything in the way he said it, but she understood enough. He wasn't the enemy. Not today, not in this moment. There was something protective in the way he stood, something that made her believe he wasn't about to. Let the hidden danger reach her. He stepped closer until he stood only a few feet away. She watched him look up at the ropes holding her. His eyes traced the knots, noticing how rough they were, how the fibers had cut into her skin. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger toward her, but toward whoever had left her in such a cruel way. Then he glanced back toward the brush, making sure the hidden figure had not moved again. He slipped a small blade from his belt, holding it in a way that showed he intended to use it on the ropes, not on her. But before he cut her free, he listened again. The silence from the brush was too strong, too careful. Someone was waiting for him to act. Someone wanted him to step into a vulnerable position, and he knew it. The woman felt fear rise again as he hesitated. She didn't want him to walk into danger, yet she didn't want to remain tied in this helpless state either. She studied him as he weighed his choices. The land seemed to hold its breath with them. He stepped around her slowly, placing himself so that if anything came from the brush, he would be the one facing it first. Then he cut the first rope. It snapped cleanly. The second rope loosened right after, and her arms dropped suddenly. She nearly fell, her legs shaking under her, but he caught her before she hit the ground. His hold was firm but gentle, steadying her without making her feel trapped. She leaned into him for a short moment, trying to find strength again. Her legs were numb, her body sore, her throat dry. She wanted to thank him, but her voice came out rough. He nodded slightly, understanding more from her eyes than her words. Then he helped her stand on her own, staying close enough that she wouldn't fall again. But now that she was free, the danger around them grew more real. Whoever watched from the brush would know the moment the ropes dropped. The warrior positioned himself between her and the direction of the noise, scanning the land again. The wind had changed slightly, carrying the scent of earth and dried grass, but also something else. Something unfamiliar. She clutched her arms close to her body, trying to ground herself as her mind raced. She looked around the open plains, trying to spot anything unusual. She didn't see anything at first. It looked like an empty stretch of land, but she knew better than to trust what looked empty. She had learned painfully fast that danger hid in plain sight out here. The warrior guided her. A few steps away from the wooden frame. She moved slowly, painfully, but the farther they walked, the more she felt the ropes loosen their grip on her mind. Still, the sign reading Apache Land hung above the frame like a cruel marker. It wasn't a message from the warrior. It wasn't from his people. Someone wanted to stir trouble. Someone wanted travelers to fear the Apache and blame them for cruelty they didn't commit. She watched the warrior study the tracks on the ground. His sharp eyes narrowed as he followed marks in the dust. He could see things she couldn't, the direction of the footprints, the weight of the steps, the number of riders who had passed through. Her heart pounded as she wondered what he saw in those shallow prints. After a moment, he turned back to her and asked how many people she had been traveling with. She gave him the number quietly, her voice rough but steady. He nodded once, absorbing the information. Then he asked if any of them had enemies or had spoken of trouble recently. She tried to think. The journey had been long, tiring, and filled with strangers passing through. She remembered one man in the group arguing with someone about land rights. She remembered two others whispering far from the campfire. She tried to piece it all together, but her memory from that night was tangled and foggy. He didn't pressure her. He simply listened, waiting for anything useful. She told him about the attack before dawn, how everything happened too fast, how she never saw the faces of the ones who grabbed her. She told him how her group had argued earlier that day about crossing near Apache territory. Some feared it. Some ignored warnings. She had just followed the group, hoping the journey would lead to a new beginning. Now she realized how fragile plans were in the old American frontier. The warrior stood still after hearing her story. He looked back at the wooden frame, then toward the brush, then at the distant hills. His silence wasn't cold. It was thoughtful. He was putting the puzzle together. Even if he didn't yet know what shape the final picture would take, suddenly the brush rustled again. This time the sound was quick, like someone pulling back sharply. The warrior raised his hand for the woman to stay behind him. She obeyed without question. Her heart pounded as she watched him shift his stance, ready but not aggressive. The silence grew tight again, the kind that made every breath feel too loud. Then a figure on horseback flashed briefly between the trees. It was fast, as if the rider only wanted to check whether she had been freed. The warrior caught the sight instantly. The rider disappeared just as quickly, forcing both of them to wonder whether he was alone or part of a larger group waiting out of sight. The warrior stepped forward, trying to see the path the rider took. Dust lifted faintly in the distance, just enough to show that whoever it was had no intention of stopping. They were moving toward the ridge, away from the two of them. But that didn't mean the danger was gone. It meant the game had changed. The woman looked at the warrior, her voice shaking as she asked whether the rider would return. He didn't answer right away. He looked across the land again, reading something invisible to her. Then he spoke quietly, telling her that whoever left her there hadn't finished what they started. She felt her stomach twist. The relief of being freed faded into a heavier fear. She wished she could understand why anyone would want to use her as part of their plan. She wished she could see the reason behind all this. But the mystery only deepened. The warrior motioned for her to follow him. He knew they couldn't stay here. The open plain was too exposed. Shadows were moving behind the hills. Tracks led in different directions. Someone had planned this well, and whoever they were didn't want her alive long enough to tell the truth. As she walked behind him, each step painful but determined, the warrior scanned the horizon again. He didn't know who the riders were. He didn't know their motives yet. But he knew one thing with certainty. They were still watching. They were still waiting. And they had just lost control of whatever plan they had set in motion. He guided her toward a narrow trail leading away from the wooden frame. She kept glancing back, feeling as though the land behind them held secrets she wasn't ready to face. The warrior stayed alert, watching every turn, every shadow, every shift in the wind. She followed him because she didn't have another choice, but also because she felt safer near him than anywhere else. Still, the tension didn't ease. The danger didn't fade. Whoever rode away wasn't running. They were regrouping. And whoever hid behind that first sound in the brush hadn't shown themselves fully. The land wasn't done with them yet. They walked until the wooden frame with the sign was a small mark behind them on the open land. The woman's legs still shook now and then, but each step came a little steadier. The Apache warrior kept a careful pace, not rushing her, but never letting his guard down. The old American frontier had taught him that danger often came from behind, where memory and dust blended together. He knew they were not done with whoever had left her hanging under the words Apache Land. That kind of message did not belong to his people. It belonged to someone who wanted trouble. After a while, he led her toward a narrow cut in the land where the ground dipped and a few dry bushes broke the emptiness. It was not a perfect hiding place, but it offered some cover from wandering eyes. He motioned for her to sit on a flat rock. She sank down with a sharp breath, feeling the relief of taking weight off her tired legs. Her wrists stung as blood returned more fully to her hands. She looked at him, still unsure how to speak to a man she'd been taught to fear and yet now trusted more than anyone else in miles. He knelt in front of her and gently took one of her wrists, turning it to see the rope marks. She tensed for a second, then relaxed when she felt how careful his touch was. He tore a strip from a piece of cloth tied at his own belt and wrapped it around her skin. He did the same for the other wrist. It was a small act, but it felt like more than kindness. It felt like a quiet promise that he would not let whoever did this finish the job. To keep her mind busy and to understand the conflict better. He asked her more about the group she had traveled with across the frontier. She told him there had been families, a few hired hands, and one man who seemed more interested in land maps than in the people he traveled with. He was always talking about claims, borders, and rights, using words like development and progress. She had not liked the way his eyes lit up when he spoke about pushing deeper into Apache land. He talked about the Apache as if they were a problem to move, not people who already lived there. The warrior listened carefully. He knew men like that existed in growing numbers. Ranchers who wanted more grazing space, prospectors who wanted hills for themselves, speculators who looked at maps and only saw opportunity where other people saw home. More than once, such men had tried to stir the army or the town against the Apache by blaming them for attacks they did not commit. If someone had left a white woman tied under a sign that accused his people, it meant someone was trying to build a story dangerous enough to start war. She also spoke of a quiet cowboy in the group. He rode at the edges of the wagon line and never joined long conversations. Yet once, when the man with the maps had insulted the Apache in front of others, that cowboy had muttered that people should respect land that was not theirs. She remembered the way they glared at each other like two sides of the same open wound. She wondered now where that cowboy was and whether he knew she was gone. As they rested, the warrior shared a bit of his side, not in long speeches but in small pieces. He told her that this stretch of land had belonged to his people long before the rail lines and towns. He spoke about how Apache families moved across these hills, hunting, trading, and living close to the earth. He spoke about patrols he and others made to keep watch on the trails, not because they wanted to harm travelers, but because too many troubles had started with strangers who did not understand the land or the people in it. She listened and slowly began to see Apache territory not as a dark unknown, but as a home someone was trying very hard to protect. While they talked, he kept one ear tuned to the distance. Far off, horses moved. Not many, but enough to stir concern. He could feel the conflict tightening. Somewhere between the town she came from and the hills he called home, men were making plans that involved her, his people, and the line on the map that outsiders called Apache Land, the old American frontier, was full of such lines, drawn without asking those who lived there first. When lines like that mixed with fear and greed, blood often followed. He decided they could not stay hidden all day. If those riders were heading toward town, they might be telling a story already, saying the Apache had taken a woman, perhaps even saying she had been found dead. If that happened, angry men might ride out with rifles, looking for the nearest Apache camp. He could not allow his people to be blamed for something they had not done. The conflict was no longer just about saving her. It was about stopping a fire before it reached both their worlds. He told her they needed to move toward a place where he could read the rider tracks more clearly. She stood wincing but nodded. She did not fully understand his plan, but she understood that standing still was no longer safe. They moved along the narrow cut, following the curve of the land until it widened into a dry creek bed. There, he crouched and studied the ground. Hoof marks crossed each other, some older and faded, some fresh and sharp. She watched in silence as he traced patterns with his eyes, as if the earth itself was speaking to him, from the way the prints overlapped. He could tell at least 3 riders had passed through recently. Their horses were not ridden in Apache fashion. The spacing and depth gave that away. These were men from town or from a nearby ranch. One of them had circled closer to where she had been tied, then turned back in haste. That had to be the rider they saw near the brush. The other tracks led in a different direction, toward the distant line of trees that marked a river, and beyond it, a settlement. He straightened and looked toward the settlement line. She understood his unspoken thought. If they reached town before the story twisted too far, maybe trouble could be slowed. But if they rode in and someone saw her with an Apache warrior, that could make everything worse. The conflict now had layers. Whoever framed the Apache wanted fear. The town already held old tension. And she was the living proof that the story being told might be a lie. An uneasy idea formed between them. Somewhere out there, someone knew exactly what had been done to her. Maybe that man with the maps? Maybe another rider from the group. Maybe they hoped to use her as a spark to burn the fragile peace between settlers and Apache. To stop them, the warrior and the woman would need more than survival. They would need truth, and someone willing to listen to it. As they moved on, the sun climbed higher, making the land shimmer in waves. They walked and then rested, walked and then listened. At one point they heard distant gunshots, not many, but enough to remind them that life out here was always balanced on thin edges. The sound came from the direction of a ranch or trail, not from the Apache hills. Still, it added to the weight pressing on both of them. The old American frontier was not calm. It was a restless place where any rumor could turn men into enemies overnight, the woman found herself thinking about the people she left behind. There had been a widow with 2 small children, hoping for a fresh start on new land. There had been a young couple, full of dreams and blind to danger. There had been the quiet cowboy, whose wary eyes had once met hers across the campfire, sharing an unspoken sense that not everyone in their group could be trusted. If word reached them that an Apache warrior had taken her, what would they believe? Would anyone think to question the story? The warrior had his own worries. He thought of his family, his people, the elders who tried to speak of peace while others spoke of war. They knew the army could be stirred with the right kind of tale. They knew a frightened town might demand action. He had seen once how a lie told by a single loud man in a saloon had led to a raid on a camp that had done nothing wrong. He would not watch that happen again if he could help it. As the day stretched on, the land opened in front of them, showing a fork in their path. One way led toward the hills where his people gathered. The other leaned slowly toward the town road, where wagons rolled and cowboys, farmers, and ranch hands moved in and out with supplies, rumors, and grudges. He stopped, feeling the full weight of the choice. She stopped beside him, feeling it too. Even if she did not yet know all the risks tied to each direction, the conflict now lay clear between them, even if they had not given it a name. It was not only the danger of whoever had left her under that sign. It was the wider struggle between the Apache defending their land and outsiders pushing deeper into it. It was the fear in town, the greed of men with maps, the harsh stories told in low voices after too much whiskey. It was every misunderstanding that had ever grown into a fight simply because no one stopped it in time. The Apache warrior looked from the hills to the faint trail toward town, his jaw set but his eyes troubled. The white woman watched him, understanding that whatever he chose would change both their lives. Somewhere beyond the horizon, riders who knew the truth were already shaping their own version of what happened. Somewhere behind them, the wooden frame with its cruel sign still stood against the sky. Ready to be found by the next traveler, the land waited, the air tight with possibility as they stood at that fork, caught between 2 worlds and a conflict that had only just begun to show its true size. The warrior looked down. The 2 paths again, one leading toward his people and the other toward the town where trouble was likely already brewing. The woman watched him, feeling the tension coil tighter in the air. Neither direction felt safe, and neither of them knew which danger would reach them first. The sun cast long lines across the dry ground, and even the breeze felt heavy, like it was carrying warnings from every direction. The old American frontier always had a way of making choices feel heavier than they looked. He finally stepped toward the trail that leaned closer to town but still kept the hills within reach. It was a narrow middle ground, a place where they could watch both sides without stepping too deep into either. She followed him without hesitation. She didn't know how the conflict would end, but she believed he was the only one who could guide her through it. Each step forward felt like stepping deeper into a storm that was building behind the scenes. As they moved along the trail, their senses sharpened. The warrior kept his eyes on the land, scanning for fresh tracks, dust rising, the faintest change in the wind. She listened just as carefully, every sound sending chills up her spine. Even the rustle of dry grass made her heart quicken. They were moving fast, but not fast enough to outrun the tension thickening in the air. After a long stretch, they reached a high ridge overlooking the land that spread toward the town. From up here, the warrior could see more clearly. Smoke curled slowly above the far wooden rooftops, nothing alarming at first glance, but to him it carried meaning. Smoke at this hour meant gatherings, men talking, plans forming. She followed his gaze and felt her stomach tighten. Although the town looked peaceful from afar, there was an undercurrent in the air that made her skin crawl. He crouched, signaling her to do the same. They hid behind a boulder while he studied the wider land. Hoof marks showed recent riders heading into the town, likely delivering twisted versions of what had happened to her. Men like the ones she had described earlier thrived on fear. They could turn a small lie into a fire that spread through an entire settlement. The warrior knew how quickly misunderstandings grew into danger once the wrong men took control of a story. She watched him as he traced lines in the dirt, with a firm concentration. She could tell he was thinking of his people, of how fast blame could come their way if they didn't act soon. The old American frontier had seen too many conflicts start from moments like this. A false accusation, a frightened town, a leader who wanted more land than he deserved, and caught between all of it, people who never asked for trouble to begin with. She wanted to help. She wanted to speak, to say something that might ease the pressure he carried, but her throat tightened with worry. Instead, she pointed softly toward the horizon where a faint trail of dust rose. Someone was riding hard, heading toward town. The warrior saw it too. He stood slowly and motioned for her to stay close. They needed to move before the next wave of lies reached the people. Their steps quickened along the ridge. The land curved sharply, and they followed it, using its shape to stay hidden. She stumbled once, tiredness pulling at her legs, but he steadied her without breaking stride. The landscape ahead opened into a shallow valley dotted with shrubs and broken wagon tracks. As they moved deeper into it, she realized the path felt familiar. Her group had passed near this place days before. She remembered the widow speaking softly to her children here. She remembered the cowboy who rode off to scout ahead, silent as always. The warrior paused suddenly, raising a hand. She froze. The land was too quiet. Not peaceful, but expectant. Then she saw what he saw. A broken wagon wheel half buried in dust. Torn canvas flapping lightly in the breeze. And near it, a piece of cloth she recognized from one of the traveling families. Her chest tightened with dread. Something had happened here. He approached the abandoned wagon slowly, scanning for any sign of movement. She followed him with cautious steps, her heart pounding so loud it felt like the ground should hear it. There were no bodies, no footprints that suggested violence, but there were signs of hurried departure. Crates thrown aside, supplies scattered. The earth looked like it had been disturbed recently. The warrior knelt, brushing dust from a set of tracks. 3 horses, all carrying riders. He traced the prints further, noticing how deep they sank into the earth. The riders had moved quickly, almost frantically. She watched him read the tracks as if the ground spoke directly to him. It wasn't just her group that had been disrupted. Something larger was happening, pulling people in directions they didn't expect. A sudden sound came from behind a cluster of dry brush. She startled, stepping closer to the warrior. He had already turned toward it, his body tense, ready for whatever emerged. A moment later, the quiet cowboy she remembered stepped out from behind the brush. His clothes were dusty, his face lined with worry, and his horse nowhere in sight. He froze when he saw them, especially the warrior. His hand hovered near his hip, but he didn't draw his weapon. The woman called his name softly. Relief flickered in his eyes as soon as he recognized her, but confusion quickly followed. He asked what happened to her, where she had been, and why she was with an Apache warrior. His voice wasn't angry. It was tired, strained, as if he had seen enough trouble in a short span. The warrior didn't step back, but he didn't reach for a weapon either. The cowboy looked between them, trying to understand. She told him quickly, her voice shaking, about being taken, being left under the sign, and being rescued. She pleaded for him to listen without jumping to fear. To her surprise, he did. The cowboy had always been quiet, but not foolish. He knew that false stories traveled fast on the frontier. He knew how lies could destroy innocent people. He rubbed his face with both hands and said he had been looking for her. After the attack before dawn, everyone panicked. Some blamed raiders. Others blamed the Apache. But the man with the maps had been too quick to take charge. He gathered a few riders and headed straight for town, telling everyone he would bring help. The cowboy said he didn't trust that man, not with the way he talked about Apache Land. When the cowboy tried to follow, his horse was spooked by gunfire in the distance, and he was thrown. He had been searching on foot ever since. The warrior listened closely. Everything matched the fear he had carried in his chest since freeing her. The man with the maps was using the chaos to his advantage. If he reached town first, he would twist the story until it became ammunition. He would say the Apache took her. He would say the Apache attacked the wagon group. And frightened men with rifles wouldn't think twice about riding toward the hills to retaliate. The cowboy looked toward the town, then back at them. He understood the urgency. He said they needed to get ahead of that man before he rallied half the settlement around a lie. But the warrior shook his head. Going straight into town would be dangerous. One Apache walking in with a terrified woman might look like confirmation of the lies. The tension would snap like a stretched rope. The conflict would explode. They stood in the quiet valley, each of them trying to piece together a way forward. Their enemy was not a ghost or a wandering threat. It was a man with influence and ambition, pushing both sides toward disaster. The woman felt fear rising again. She had escaped one trap only to find herself caught in a larger one. The cowboy rested a hand on her shoulder and told her they would figure it out. But even he looked uncertain. The warrior's eyes narrowed as he studied the land. He saw something the others hadn't yet noticed. Fresh tracks leading away from the wagon site, different from the earlier ones. Lighter, quicker, and moving toward a rocky bluff. Someone else had been here after the cowboy arrived. Someone watching from a distance. The warrior motioned toward the tracks. The cowboy tensed again. Whoever left those prints could be scouting for the man with the maps. They followed the tracks quietly, moving through the valley until they reached the base of the bluff. The warrior motioned for silence. The woman felt her breath lock in her chest. They climbed slowly, careful not to send rocks tumbling. At the top, the land opened into a wide view of the plains. And there, near the ridge, they saw him, one rider, shadowed by the lowering sun, watching the town. Watching the trails, watching everything. He carried himself with the confidence of someone who believed he had already won. They couldn't see his face clearly, but they didn't need to. They knew who it was. The man with the maps. And he wasn't alone. Across the ridge, more riders waited, hidden enough to stay unseen unless someone knew where to look. Men ready to spread more fear. Men ready to ride at the first sign of trouble. The woman felt her heartbeat rise fast. The cowboy clenched his jaw. The warrior remained still, but his eyes darkened with understanding. The conflict had grown bigger than any of them expected. And now, standing on the ridge with enemies gathering and the truth hanging by a thread, they were closer to the climax than they realized. But the story was far from over. The ridge held a stillness that felt like the last, quiet breath before a storm. The Apache warrior, the woman, and the cowboy crouched low, watching the man with the map stare out over the land like he already owned it. The riders behind him sat waiting, their horses restless, their shadows long in the late light. It was clear now what he wanted. By placing her under the sign and rushing to town with a twisted story, he hoped to turn fear into permission. If the town believed the Apache had taken her or harmed her, then a full attack on Apache land would seem justified. Once the dust settled, he and his partners would claim whatever land they wanted. The woman felt the truth settle deep in her chest. She had feared death when she was tied under that sign, but now she feared something larger. This wasn't just about her. It was about peace between two sides already struggling to understand each other. It was about families in the town, about Apache children in the hills, about whether the old American frontier would grow harsher or wiser. The warrior placed a hand lightly on her shoulder, grounding her thoughts. He had a plan forming behind his calm expression. The cowboy leaned close and whispered that they could not let those riders move toward town or toward the hills without the truth. They had to stop the lie, and the only way to do that was to confront the man with the maps directly. While they still had the chance, they waited until the group on the ridge shifted slightly, the leader signaling the rest to get ready. That was their moment. The warrior stepped forward first, making his presence known without rushing. The cowboy followed with the woman between them for protection. The man with the maps turned sharply when he noticed movement. His expression flickered with disbelief, then anger. He hadn't expected her to be alive, and he hadn't expected the Apache warrior to be the one standing beside her. One of his riders whispered nervously, and another shifted in his saddle. The tension twisted across the ridge like a rope pulled too tight. The man with the maps tried to recover his confidence, calling out loudly that they should be careful, because the Apache had captured the woman, and the cowboy must have been forced into helping. But the cowboy shouted back, clear and steady, that the story was a lie. He told them how she had been taken by unknown riders before dawn, how she had been left to die with a sign meant to spark hatred, and how an Apache warrior had saved her life. Not threatened it, the riders murmured, their certainty shaken. The woman stepped forward then, her voice rough but strong. She said the warrior had protected her, given her water, freed her from the ropes, and guided her across dangerous ground. She said the ones who tied her had done it to make people believe the Apache were the enemy. She explained how the man with the maps had always talked about land, how he had wanted to push deeper into Apache territory, and saw her suffering as a tool to get what he wanted. The warrior stepped beside her, not speaking loudly, but with a quiet strength that reached the riders more deeply than shouting ever could. He said his people had not taken her. They had not attacked the wagon group. They had simply guarded the land they lived on. He told them he had tracked the men who left her and knew their horses were not Apache horses. The details in his voice, steady and precise, made the truth feel like a stone laid firmly on the ground. The man with the maps panicked. He tried to rally his riders, saying they couldn't trust her words because she had been frightened, confused, misled by the warrior. But his voice didn't carry the same power anymore. The cowboy stepped forward, facing the men directly. He reminded them that every one of them had heard the mapmaker speak of Apache land as if it were his to claim. He reminded them how eager the man had been to ride into town with the tale of an attack, even before anyone knew what happened. The riders began to look at each other, doubt spreading across the ridge like a slow wind. Desperate, the man with the maps reached for his rifle, but the warrior moved swiftly, stepping between him and the woman. The cowboy drew his weapon too, pointing it not in aggression but in warning. The riders saw how quickly things would worsen if the mapmaker chose violence. One of the younger riders urged the leader to stop, saying they came to help a missing woman, not to start a war someone else wanted. Cornered, the mapmaker realized he had lost control. He lowered his rifle, not willingly, but because no one behind him supported him anymore. He tried to talk his way out of it, claiming he only wanted to protect settlers, claiming he misunderstood, claiming he acted for the good of the town. But the woman stepped closer and said with clear conviction that if he had succeeded, innocent families on both sides would have paid the price. The riders nodded slowly. One by one, they moved their horses away from the mapmaker. The leader of the small group shook his head, saying they would return to town and tell the truth, not the twisted version they had been fed. The mapmaker had no more allies. He backed away as they turned their horses, leaving him behind on the ridge. The cowboy told him quietly that his greed nearly destroyed lives, and that the land was not his to carve up. With that, the group rode hard for town, ready to clear the confusion before any hot-headed men decided to act on fear. The woman let out a long breath. She didn't realize she'd been holding. Her knees weakened and she steadied herself with her hand. The warrior helped her sit on a flat rock at the top of the ridge. The cowboy stood nearby, rubbing his jaw with quiet relief. They watched the riders disappear toward the settlement. Carrying the truth with them, the warrior spoke softly, saying the worst of the danger was past. The woman nodded, though the weight of the day still pressed heavily on her shoulders. She thanked him again, her voice filled with a kind of gratitude that could not be measured in words. She thanked the cowboy as well, for standing by her when he could have chosen the easier path of staying silent. They began their slow walk off the ridge. The land around them felt different now, not lighter, but calmer, like a storm had passed without breaking everything in its path. When they reached the lower valley, the cowboy found his horse grazing peacefully behind a scrub of bush as if nothing had happened. He laughed under his breath, grateful for the simple luck. The woman smiled faintly at the sound. The warrior's eyes softened as he watched both of them. They rode and walked together until their paths divided. The cowboy would go to town to make sure the truth was told clearly and fully. The warrior would return to his people to explain what had happened and ensure no one acted out of fear. The woman stood between them for a long moment, torn between two worlds. But instead of dividing her, the moment filled her with something new, Hope. She hugged the cowboy gently, thanking him for taking the risk to trust the truth. Then she turned to the warrior. He looked at her for a long, steady moment, and she could see the depth of understanding in his eyes. She reached for his hand, grateful beyond measure. He accepted it with quiet strength. Before leaving, he gave her a final reminder that peace could survive even in hard places, but only if people protected it as fiercely as they protected land or family. She nodded, holding his words close. Then they parted, each moving toward the next chapter of their life with a sense of purpose. When the woman returned to town with the cowboy's help, she found people already calmer. The story spreading through the streets was no longer twisted by fear. It was about a woman saved, not harmed, about an Apache warrior who protected instead of hurting, about the importance of truth over rumor on the old American frontier. The mapmaker was confronted by town elders and held responsible for spreading lies. Families whispered about how close they had come to starting something terrible, and how thankful they were that the truth came forward in time. She stayed with the widow from her wagon group while she recovered. For days, she thought about the warrior who had saved her life. She thought about how quickly darkness had turned into understanding. She knew she would return to the ridge someday, not in fear, but in gratitude. And somewhere in the hills, the Apache warrior stood watching the land he protected, remembering the woman he had saved and hoping that the truth they fought for would take root in a world that often grew too wild for peace. The conflict had passed. The tension had eased. And through courage, trust, and unexpected unity, both sides found a path toward something better. It was a hard journey, but it led them all toward a good and hopeful ending. The kind that reminded everyone that even on the old American frontier, truth and understanding could change the course of a life.